Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about ancestral Puebloan history, specifically that from the Colorado Plateau area of the Four Corners region in North America. The Colorado Plateau is located in the southwestern part of what is today the United States, in the western part of North America, the southern end of the Rocky Mountains before they transition into the mountain ranges of the Sierra Madre Occidental and the Sierra Madre Oriental that run down into Mexico. You can see in the map there on the right the general distribution of the plateau. And what really defines it is that this plateau drains into the Colorado River. And given the amount of water that is drawn off of the Colorado River into the modern states of California, Nevada, and Arizona to support cities like Phoenix and Los Angeles and Las Vegas, in some ways, this is the headwaters of a good portion of the water that we actually use. So it's a significant geographic place even today. It's also quite possibly one of the most beautiful portions of the continent. If you like desert landscapes, it's hands down in the top three in the world. This view here is at Arches National Monument in Utah. And it also contains some of the most iconic landscapes. Monument Valley, for example, seen in many westerns and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. A well-recognized landscape all around the world, with a stark beauty. And it's also important to recognize that it's usually thought of as being a desert, and it certainly is, part of an arid landscape. But it ranges from lower portions, lower elevations that are very much in the traditional desert concept, to shrublands, to forests, juniper and pinyon and pine. These aren't rainforests by any stretch of the imagination, but there are dense stands of trees in the mountain ranges of this area. And in the higher elevations, you have snow-capped peaks and alpine type settings. So it runs a range, much like we've talked about throughout the world, and especially in Western North America. The vertical distribution of environments is actually quite key. And the ability of people throughout time in the Southwest to occupy locations, but because different environments may not be that distant, it may only be 25 miles to a forest, even if your village is in the desert. This presents opportunities to access different sets of resources rather than being locked into one specific set. And that was a strategy used by a number of people throughout time. When we're talking about ancestral Puebloans, this is the area including the southeastern part of Utah, southwestern part of Colorado, northwestern part of New Mexico, and the northeastern part of Arizona. Bordered to the south by other agricultural groups known as the Mogollon, and to the southwest, the groups referred to as the Hohokam, which you may be familiar with from this class or others. What's important here, what's really key here is the distinction between what we refer to as the Southwest and neighboring areas, especially in the deep past, often has as much to do with the clear and distinct agricultural foundations of the region. Maize, beans, and ceramics introduced from Mesoamerica. And interestingly, though, the Four Corners area itself, in contrast to the Hohokam region further south and west, appears to have had a bit of a lag time, because even though the earliest maize is here by 2000 BCE, the first 2 millennia after that introduction saw relatively little increase in the size of settlements or the permanence of these settlements, and population density didn't really tick up in a big way. What appears to have happened is that there was a pattern of shifting cultivation, where the villages and fields would be moved after a few years, because when you're doing this kind of low intensity horticulture, gardening, especially in landscapes where the soils are not remarkably rich, you get declines in production. And since the landscape wasn't full, in a sense, there was a lot of open available land because of these lower population densities. People took advantage of that, and when they saw declining returns in their fields at one location, they would just move to another location. It was a much simpler solution to that problem. But even given the fact there was open space, a lot of that open space isn't very productive for agriculture, especially in the sense of a lot of that space doesn't have access to water. And because of this, people would come back to the same spots and reoccupy villages that they had occupied before, maybe after periods of 10 to 20 years. But it's not a absolutely continuous occupation. But if you recall from our discussions of radiocarbon dating, the resolution of that is plus or minus 20, 25 years, and so you might not be able to see the distinctions here. Fortunately, in the Southwest, we have access to another dating technique that does give us pretty good temporal resolution for certain time periods. We'll talk about that in a minute. This makes the Colorado Plateau's history different from the areas of Sonora and Arizona occupied by the Hohokam and their relatives, who developed sophisticated irrigation systems much earlier. Possibly because the landscapes that were being occupied by the Hohokam, places like the Gila and Salt Rivers, had topographies that were much more amenable to the development of such systems. That being said, there is a great deal of variability through time and space on the Colorado Plateau. And this is probably due to the fact that people are adjusting to hyper-local conditions on these fragmented patches of arable land. The conditions in one spot where you can farm may be totally distinct from the conditions in another spot. So you'll have to use different strategies. And because during this basket maker period, people were not occupying one spot for generations, maybe only a decade or so, it was necessary to change strategies and be flexible about how you were going to produce your subsistence. This basket maker period that I'm referring to refers to the time after the introduction of maize, but before the adoption of ceramic technology. There's still substantial hunting and gathering of plants and animals, and it's an interesting parallel development with the pre-pottery Neolithic of the Near East in the Old World, given that the earliest use of domesticated plants occurs long before the adoption of ceramic container technology. So that makes for some interesting potential comparative discussions there. Very little, if any, evidence for social hierarchies has been found, and this suggests to us that political organization was, at the group level, relatively egalitarian with few fixed differences in status. This picture here shows a basket maker, a drawing of a basket maker basket, along with some footgear, a sock, and a sandal bottom that have been recovered from caves dating to this time period in the region. As a little aside, the weapon technology that's being used by people during this time period, during basket maker and all the earlier time periods in the region, was the atlatl, the spear thrower. This was used throughout the Americas until the last 1,500 years or so, because the bow and arrow was introduced from the Arctic sometime around 3 to 400 AD, or 83 to 400. And prior to that, this was the projectile technology being used across the continent. This weapon system, detailed here, if you care to see the engineering drawing there and the mechanics of how it functions, really useful illustrations here. It's extremely effective in open country, which there's plenty of in the Southwest. It's not as effective in densely forested environments because you have to stand fully up, you have to throw a baseball, and if you can imagine a Major League Baseball pitcher trying to throw a baseball in a densely forested area, you would get some of the same results. It doesn't have that capacity to fire from cover like a bow and arrow does. It's more powerful than a bow. The force that the impact of one of these darts has on the target is much greater than the force of impact from an arrow, but it's effective over a shorter distance. If you're interested, there's a link there to some experimental archaeology that people were doing, replicating actually specifically basket maker period atlatls from the Southwest. Basket maker architecture is interesting because it's a shift away from less permanent type structures and move to a greater investment in labor and material and a greater permanence of occupation. You don't spend quite this much time if you're just going to be there for a week, right? And part of this was because of the increased production and dependence on maize. There's an attendant incentive for greater storage. And if you store a lot of stuff, then that means you can't be as mobile. So these semi-subterranean pit houses become the most common form of residence in the region. They're pretty fantastic, especially for a region like this. They're cooler in the winter. They're cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter than above ground facilities. So they really stabilize the temperature for you. What's interesting in these basket maker villages, that storage facilities are not usually located inside the houses, but in common shared areas, suggesting that the surplus that's being produced may not actually be owned by individuals or even individual families, but may be held in common by the entire community. Between about 1 and 400 of the Common Era, ceramics increasingly become the dominant container technology here on the Colorado Plateau. At other places, further to the south and west in the Hohokam areas, ceramics and agricultural systems, complex agricultural systems were adopted and employed at a much earlier date. But here in the ancestral Puebloan region, it was only about 1,500, little over 1,500 years ago, 1,600 years ago, that ceramics became the principal way that people made containers and cooking vessels and all of that. And at the same time, extended family households became the standard unit of economic and social organization. As a result, there's a dramatic increase in the size of these pit house structures. Rather than having to house a nuclear family, it's now housing an extended family, multiple pairs of partners and their kids, and grandma and the aunts and cousins and all of that are occupying these structures. At the same time, these storage features move inside the dwellings rather than having shared facilities of earlier centuries. So there's changes both in labor organization and ownership of goods, how they're being distributed through the communities. Populations were increasing, and these early farmers began to see greater levels of competition among neighboring communities for water and arable land. Within the communities, it became increasingly important for them to have a handle on the structure of society and how they were organizing and deploying labor. You had to be a lot more careful how you did this, how you spent the time available to the community, because there was a lot more that needed to get done on a much larger scale than before. And so there appear to have been developments in structures of leadership and social organization at this point in time. And all of that leads to the developments that ultimately archaeologists refer to as Pueblo I time period, from about 750 to 900 of the Common Era. And where you really see this in a pronounced way is along the San Juan River in southwest Colorado and southeast Utah. You get relatively permanent villages beginning to form, and these are made up of these clusters of surface rooms with shared walls, and then pit houses in the adjacent area. Now it's unclear whether this is a transitional thing, whether some people are still living in the pit houses, or whether the settlement starts with the pit houses and then moves to above ground, if they're still using them simultaneously, because the changes are happening not now on the order of centuries between one notable pattern and another one, but decades. And so the resolution, the chronological resolution that we're able to look at, may actually not give us a fine-grained enough picture to be able to see, exactly how this process is occurring. But it's clearly a major phase of change and innovation. It's at this point in time in the region that populations probably got bigger than 100 for the first time. These rooms aren't stone construction, though. They're wattle and daub, which is wooden posts that then have withies and warps woven between the wooden posts. And then that kind of basketry framework is then plastered with mud plaster on both sides. And so you create this structure that you then put a mud plaster covering on. There's still no real evidence for distinct social hierarchy or differential access to resources among community residents. It's kind of interesting. One of the things that emerges very clearly and very importantly for later First Nations people in the region is the kiva. These structures are circular, mostly subterranean, with a variety of spaces and structures inside of them. They appear to mimic the ancestral pit houses, right? Which is interesting when you think about the cosmologies and a lot of the origin myths for people in the region talking about emergence, right? So the ancestors emerge into this world, and so that act is being replicated every time somebody comes out of one of these kivas. These are not residential structures anymore, though. They are ritual, social, political, and are still used in modern Pueblo villages today. And there's very clear continuity in the architecture of these features over the last 1,500 years. The largest of the early kivas from Pueblo I was found at Grass Mesa, Pueblo, and was 74 feet in diameter, with a floor area exceeding 4,300 square feet. That is a big room even today. And so the amount of effort that goes into constructing these and maintaining them is truly immense. These are very important places. One of the archaeologists that worked on that project, Ricky Lightfoot, estimates that it took the entire community of Grass Mesa more than 2 months to construct that kiva. So these are undoubtedly focal points for community, religion, and politics. Especially interesting is that you have great kivas at some sites and not at others. And so they may have been shared by several neighboring sites who would all make use of this one space for certain rituals and ceremonies. Also during this time, we see evidence for frequent migrations, and this is really quite interesting. The remarkable chronological resolution I was talking about provided by dendrochronology, tree ring dating, allows us to look at ancestral Puebloan history with a much finer focus than in a lot of other areas of North America. So in this area, after about 800 of the Common Era, we see occasional interregional migrations where whole villages would be abandoned and then reestablished in new locations, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. This is a process that's really, really quite remarkable, and that we're able to finally have the resolution in time and space to be able to see it is really impressive. This is fascinating. And this large-scale residential mobility is likely a response to the inability of food production strategies and technology to sustain local populations across the arid region. And again, this contrasts with the story from the Hohokam region to the south and west, where you see much larger populations, much higher population densities, without this frequent relocation going on. So it's a different kind of story being told in these different areas of the Southwest. Following this formative time period, you see the development of what archaeologists in the region refer to as Pueblo II, from about 900 to 1150 of the Common Era. The small farming settlements established during Pueblo I expanded their range and filled in some of the areas that had been left unoccupied during Pueblo I times. During Pueblo II, the San Juan Basin of mostly in northwestern New Mexico becomes a major demographic center of population. Farming techniques, though, in a regional sense, are still fairly generalized, making it easier to transport them from place to place when villages need to be relocated. It's also, this is the time period of the emergence and florescence of Chaco Canyon. Here you see a map of the San Juan Basin. Right there in the middle of your screen, you see the location of Chaco Canyon National Park. And this sort of area here in the northwestern part of New Mexico is the principal core of the San Juan River drainage, the San Juan Basin. Up there from Farmington, Durango, even up to Mesa Verde. In the late 900s and early 1000s, populations began to shift from these scattered little farming communities with a few houses, maybe a dozen families or something like that, to these densely aggregated communities centered on massive communal stone masonry buildings that we now call great houses. You see them throughout the San Juan Basin, but nowhere as densely as in Chaco Canyon. Several of the Chacoan great houses contain hundreds of rooms and reach 4 4 stories in height. This here is a sort of low elevation aerial shot of Pueblo Bonito. This is the largest of the Chacoan great houses, shaped like a D, you can see there. And it had over 600 rooms. And the building itself covered 2 acres. It's also, of all the great houses, the one that has the largest number of kivas. You can see several of the largest ones right there in the plaza in the middle part of the structure. And this D-shaped form, the Pueblo Bonito, is sort of the iconic representation of that architecture that defines the time period both in Chaco itself and beyond the canyon. During the Bonito phase of the region, it's a time of immense cooperative effort. To give you an idea, in Chaco Canyon itself, at least 200,000 wooden beams were used in their construction, and all of those had to be brought from at least 25 to 60 miles away in the Chusca Mountains. A majority of the work in the canyon took place between 1000 and 1100. After 1100, there's a major decline and eventual abandonment of Chaco Canyon by the late 1200s. What's really interesting, there's some recent work that suggests that the local agricultural potential may have been much higher during this time period than people previously suspected. And that discovery may play into discussions of whether the canyon was a large demographic center or primarily a pilgrimage spot. For myself, given its eventual abandonment, I find the pilgrimage spot model less convincing, since pilgrims will continue to make use of sacred places long after the residential potential has been exhausted, and this doesn't seem to be the case at Chaco. One of the things that the Chacoan system is renowned for are the networks. And not just in terms of the goods, which we'll talk about in a second, but the literal networks, the construction of these engineered roadways across the landscape, stretching out in every direction, as you can see from these maps here, and connecting the canyon to both communities in the neighboring regions as well as resource-rich areas. The mountains that provided all of that timber being one example. Trade goods from the whole region found their way to Chaco, especially turquoise, some of which came from as far away as California and Nevada, in addition to the more local New Mexican and Arizonan sources. This turquoise may have been one of the principal reasons that Chaco became linked to the trade networks of the great imperial states of Mesoamerica. Fascinating, again, discoveries within the last 10 to 15 years. Chocolate has been found in ceramic vessels at Chaco Canyon. The nearest place this could have been produced was 1,500 miles away on the Pacific coast of Mexico. Turquoise from the same sources, the Cerrillos source there in northern New Mexico, exploited by Chacoan miners and jewelers, has been positively identified in artifacts from the Cenote de Sacrificios at Chichen Itza on the Yucatan Peninsula in southern Mexico. Brightly colored feathers from macaws and parrots were highly prized throughout the region and were traded from Mexico and may have been imported alive and bred in the Southwest at this time, and certainly later at Paquime in Chihuahua. Copper bells manufactured in West Mexico, states of Jalisco and Guanajuato, probably traded through the Hohokam settlements to the south and west, have also been found at Chaco. In addition, shell beads manufactured in the Santa Barbara Channel region of California occur in burials in some of the great houses as well. All of this just speaks to the fact that Chaco Canyon was incredibly tied into the larger world of the North American continent. It was here at the peak of Chacoan influence and interaction with the widest area that we see evidence for pronounced social inequality. Burials with literally over a ton of turquoise were found at Pueblo Bonito. And while the architecture remains monumentally communal, it seems that tensions were brewing between the collective model and the emergence of aggrandizing would-be elites within the community. Given the differences between the sources of turquoise and other trade goods recovered from various great houses, it seems that there was competition between the leading families of not only different communities, but actually of the several great houses within the canyon itself. From the great house of Chetro Kettle, you're not finding the same sources of turquoise as you're finding at Pueblo Bonito. And so it seems that they had different networks and different contacts, and that there was an effort to maybe develop new trade ties and new relationships with other communities that could give them an advantage in these exchanges that they were participating in. Really fascinating stuff happening lately especially in our ability to source things and study isotopes and really analyze some of the materials that we have recovered over time. It's interesting, Chaco Canyon also had diversity. Biometric analysis and DNA indicates that there were at least two, possibly three distinct populations living at Chaco Canyon, but that these obviously mixed between each other over time, but that there was still a strong indication that the people that came together to form this community in the first place were not all coming from one background, one geographic space. Given its ties to vast trade networks, the people must have known about a wide area of North America, if not directly, then by secondhand information from merchants and travelers. These were not people who thought the world ended at the horizon line. They knew it was a big, big world that they were part of. Architectural styles vary at Chaco Canyon as well, suggesting a lack of uniformity in the ways people chose to express their ideas, not only on an individual level, but also collectively. And in some of these great houses at Chaco Canyon, architectural choices will be made, a colonnaded walkway at one of them, that then they decide to brick up. And so there's not just diversity simultaneously, there's diversity through time. People change their minds about things and shift and adjust to match a new idea, a new concept. Fascinating. But as so many of the things that we've talked about in class Chaco comes to an end. Building completely ceases in the canyon by AD 1150. And this corresponds with the onset of the medieval drought. This was an epic drought that lasted for at least 200 years and impacted First Nations peoples all across the Americas. As a result, populations shifted northward, initially to a series of very Chaco-like settlements, including Aztec ruin, with the largest of all kivas in the southwest. You can see here the reconstruction of that kiva at Aztec ruin. This is actually inside the kiva. It's not an artist's reconstruction. It's an actual architectural reconstruction. This thing is huge and really suggestive that people were pulling out all the stops to petition the supernatural for assistance during this time period. It may be that the oral traditions of the Zuni, as discussed by Stephen Lexon in his book Chaco Meridian, actually record this period of Puebloan history and migration. These Chaco-like settlements do not last, and by 1200 they're abandoned too. The Zuni description of the people losing favor with the Casinas, the rain spirits, and being forced to abandon White House, the buildings at Chaco were often plastered, before migrating away and trying to end the displeasure of the Katsinas through larger and larger rituals, may be another accurate, if embellished, recording of this period of Puebloan history. These oral traditions match up very closely with what we're finding out with our new high-resolution archaeological record. Here you can see that discussion of, or the data on the medieval drought I was referring to, brought to you largely by dendrochronology and other geosciences. You can see there on the lower chart of the Southwest, the time period from a little bit after 1100 through to 1300 is the longest sustained period of drought conditions over the last 1,000 years. This was a truly epic drought. To give you an idea, this same drought was the one that Lake Tahoe in the Sierra Nevada, which during recent drought times can drop by as much as 6 inches. There was a 7-year drought in the early 90s here in California, and Lake Tahoe dropped 6 inches over that 7-year drought. Well, during this medieval drought, Lake Tahoe dropped 40 feet and stayed that low long enough for trees that were at least 2 feet in diameter to grow on the exposed floor. That's how much of a drought you had. So this was definitely something that would have presented a massive problem for the people at Chaco Canyon and other agricultural communities in the arid Southwest. As Chaco is abandoned and other settlements collapse, we see a complete shift in architectural style and settlement pattern. Pueblo III, which basically covers the time period of this drought, is marked by, surprisingly, you might say, large settlements, with pueblos including more than 50 rooms in the Mesa Verde region during the 1200s. But what's happening is that you have many fewer settlements. People are trying to aggregate into fewer, larger settlements that are situated in defensible locations, often with control over local water resources. And the decreasing number of locations where agriculture could support village-sized populations forced more and more communities into smaller and smaller areas. And initially, this might have been something that, could have worked, but the drought just kept going and going and going and going. And so you see increasing stresses, increasing impacts of this drought through time. Here's just a little map showing you the Mesa Verde region in contrast to the San Juan basin. So populations move north and a little bit west to this area between the San Juan River and the Colorado. The cliff dwellings. These are highly recognizable around the world as being from the Southwest. So I mean, if you show one of these images, this is the Southwest for many people in terms of archaeology. But these settlements are actually quite small, especially when compared to the Chacoan Great Houses. There's a couple dozen rooms here compared to 600 at Pueblo Bonito alone. They lack great kivas. They lack plazas. And they were only occupied for a relatively brief period of time towards the end of Pueblo III, where things were getting really, really bad. They have the appearance of refuges that were occupied as increased violence and crop failures would have forced more and more communities to be abandoned. They're really genuinely, in an absolute sense, both metaphorical and literal, up against the wall. And as you might expect, you do see a fair amount of evidence for violence during the Pueblo III period. Trauma is visible throughout the region at a low frequency in Pueblo II burials, at the end of Pueblo II, and during all of Pueblo III, evidence increases dramatically. This evidence varies, but does include disarticulated and cannibalized human remains at a number of sites, including Cowboy Wash, Colorado, where the kiva, the sacred place, was desecrated at the same time. And that act of desecration included someone defecating in this sacred place, and from the coprolite that they recovered, there was a fragment of human bone in the coprolite. This enters into the discussion of whether these were acts of desperation or structured violence designed to instill terror in your opponents. If it's an act of desperation, it's not necessarily the case that you would go to the lengths to desecrate the sacred places of your community. If, on the other hand, these are acts of structured violence, desecration of sacred places is a very consistent act that goes along with that kind of motivation for doing things. And so it puts a little bit different spin on this. It's not a, pathological serial killer thing. It's also not a survival thing in an absolute sense like the Paraguayan soccer players in the mountains. It's an act of political violence specifically designed to freak people out. And regardless of where you fall on that particular debate, this is not the low-level raiding parties that you might imagine from typical tribal conflicts. This is community destruction level warfare. One other example at Castle Rock Pueblo, the reconstruction of which shown there at the top, at least 41 people were killed in a single event that took place around 1280 of the Common Era and resulted in the destruction and abandonment of this community. So this was a time, Pueblo III was a time of collapse of the vibrant social and economic networks that had characterized Pueblo II, and the survival of much smaller groups, sometimes under grim circumstances. What comes after is Pueblo IV, from about 1300 to 1500 of the Common Era. By 1300, farming groups had completely abandoned the Colorado Plateau. Some groups were arriving through migration from the north and west, while others appeared to have switched away from farming and begun foraging on a full-time basis. An interesting kind of switch. But this increasing competition for what had been the backup resource base for Puebloan people ever since basket maker times may have led to the eventual abandonment of the last agricultural villages on the plateau. One or two bad agricultural years with heavy competition for the fallback resources may have been all it would take to break the camel's back, especially for populations that were already pretty close to the edge. The Rio Grande Pueblos. By the early 1300s, immigrants arriving from the rapidly depopulating northern areas were settling along the Rio Grande and the Little Colorado rivers in increasing numbers. And as this was happening, you get an increase in population densities. You're having to institute more intensive strategies for farming and economic production because the communities are getting larger. And so it kind of creates this feedback loop of increased populations, increased knowledge and traditions that were being brought in. And so you see a lot more intensive production and a lot more construction and a lot more water capture and control and diversion and field clearing. It's a dynamic building time period. As a result of this influx of population, rather than just local reproduction, many of these new Rio Grande Pueblos had over 1,000 rooms. So for the first time since the collapse of Chaco, you have really, really large communities. And these communities were often arranged around extremely large plazas with one or two kivas. And so that shift happens. Instead of many smaller kivas, the Pueblo IV pattern seemed to have been towards an increased emphasis on community collective action and unity rather than intra-community competition. There seems to have been too much on the line for people to be focused on the competition aspect. We're all in this together, and we're all going to survive or not. But there's a real change in the ethos of people during this time period. Even further south, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the site of Paquime in Chihuahua, sometimes referred to as Casas Grandes, but more appropriately Paquime. You can see it right there at the bottom of the map on the upper right. An aerial shot of one of the main architectural groups. A shot of one of the doorways there, and an example of some of their very distinctive and beautiful ceramic technology, or ceramic art, with a horned serpent, you might say there. And its first constructions, the earliest phases emerge as Chaco is being abandoned. It was burned during the early part of Pueblo 4, but rebuilt with compact apartment buildings. There are over 2,000 rooms in the structures at Paquime, including places for raising of macaws and parrots. There are eye-shaped ball courts and rubber balls. They're playing the Mesoamerican ball game here. Stone platforms, a clearly designated market area, and this very distinctive ceramic style. And this connects to all of this other stuff in some interesting ways. The archaeologist Stephen Lexon has noted that Paquime is aligned on roughly the same longitudinal axis as Chaco Canyon and Aztec ruins, with an error of only a few miles. I mean, they're on a straight north-south line. Chaco reached its cultural peak first, then Aztec, and then Paquime. And what's fascinating is that the similarities among these sites, argues Lexon, indicate that their ruling elites also had a ceremonial connection. And he proposes that the ruling elites, once removed from their prior positions at Chaco, reestablish their hegemony over the area at Aztec and later at Paquime. But these are some interesting elites because, again, they seem to be able to transport this political authority and power, and it's not exclusively linked to a particular spot on the landscape, at least in this region. It's a fascinating idea. Fascinating idea. As some archaeologists and anthropologists have termed it, during Pueblo 4, we see the development of the Southwest quote-unquote cult. Not a term I particularly like, but it's what you'll see in the literature. That refers to is a pan-regional religious ideology tied to water control and agricultural fertility, with an emphasis on social inclusiveness. And this spread through many of the communities during the late 1300s and 1400s. A particular type of ceramic called Salalo polychrome may be one material culture marker of people's participation in this new expansive tradition. And even more importantly, this cultural development may have lessened tensions caused during the formation of new villages, which were frequently made up of mixed ethnic and linguistic groups, all of them seeking to forge new lives and new homes after the chaos of the Pueblo III period. And this ideology about water and fertility and inclusiveness, if that was there to bind people together, then they didn't necessarily have to be part of the same ethnic group. They didn't have to all be born in the same village to work together towards common goals. That's very key to trying to understand this process. Pueblo 4 comes to an end with the beginning of the historic period, but it's important to note that despite their Herculean efforts, both physical and conceptual, during Pueblo 4 there's abundant evidence for widespread malnutrition and infectious disease. Some villages were intentionally destroyed, but over the course, beginning after the collapse of Chaco, the overall population of the farmers in the region probably dropped by about 70% by AD 1500. What's strange about this is that certainly during Pueblo IV, after the drought is over, there's no shortage of agricultural land because the population has dropped so much. There's a lot of open seats at the table, so to speak. Researchers have yet to develop any convincing ecological explanation for this precipitous decline in population through Pueblo IV, which is a time period that otherwise shows greater integration and unity within communities. If it was just about the drought, they would have been able to be building the population rather than it continuing to contract in some ways. One really important site dating to this time period is Sikyatki, which founded during Pueblo IV and extending into the historic period. It's an ancestral Hopi, specifically, site that was occupied by the Firewood clan. And Hopi oral tradition states that it was abandoned, destroyed as a result of conflict with the nearby village of Walpi. And this is recounted by the Hopi themselves. A 20th century woman named Nampeo, who was married to a man who was hired by archaeologists to assist in the archaeological excavations at Sikyatki, was inspired by the sherds that were recovered from those excavations, from the archaeological examples at the top, to revitalize the native pottery tradition. And one of her many works of art there on the bottom left. She is absolutely one of the undisputed grandmothers of contemporary Southwestern ceramic art, responsible for bringing back from the brink of extinction one of the most distinctive First Nations artistic traditions in all of North America. So recognition for her important. For these people, these ancestral Puebloan people, the Hopi, Zuni, the Keres, the Tewa, and other groups of the Rio Grande, a whole host of new challenges emerge following Pueblo IV. Warfare becomes a common theme in the rock art. But interestingly enough, this conflict may have now shifted to groups moving into the region, to being between the ancestral Puebloans and groups moving into the region, rather than being between neighboring farming communities. Some of the possible stresses maybe you have Athabascan-speaking hunter-gatherers arriving from the north, the ancestors of the Diné, Navajo, and Apache of today. Uto-Aztecan speakers from the Great Basin begin to move south and west as early as the end of Pueblo II, the fall of Chaco, and by this point in time had reached the Colorado River. And as the Little Ice Age drove farmers of the northern plains out of their mixed economy farming villages along the Missouri River, they turned towards a more mobile economy focused on bison. Still no horses. And these groups moving southward and kind of creating a domino effect of other populations occupied areas of north and northeastern New Mexico. So the ancestral Puebloans were faced with encroachment on all sides of the region. And this may be the best explanation for why farmers with structured, stable communities surrounded by abundant farmland were not able to substantially expand their populations during this period, and why their settlements were so concentrated in large aggregations. It's a lot safer to be with 100 other people than it is to be with, 2 other families, especially if you've got Comanches and Apaches and other plains groups moving in. These are not necessarily enemies, but they're also not necessarily friends. So it's a difficult time. So then throw this into the mix. Does that then mean that the Spanish may have just been another challenge? At least from the perspective of the descendants of Pueblo IV people, the initial arrival of the Spanish, apart from obvious technological issues, maybe it wasn't the psychologically jarring event it's sometimes presented as being. Just the arrival. Later issues with regard to religious traditions and oppression and disease, but the ancestral Puebloan people were already dealing with people coming in from elsewhere and encroaching on their territory. So that, in and of itself, would not have been a novel event. Regardless, the history of the region at this fascinating juncture was not as simple as a Europeans versus First Nations dichotomy. The Pueblo people were contending with new arrivals on literally every point of the compass. Social networks and demographics were changing rapidly over the next few centuries. And from the late 1500s onward, it was a constant challenge to adjust to the dynamic situations. From an anthropological standpoint, this is a truly fascinating time period. One example of this would be the discussion of Awadavi, a village on Second Mesa in the Hopi Nation. This village was founded sometime after 1300 and rapidly grew to be one of the most important settlements in the area. It was the first of the Hopi villages conquered by the Spanish. After the successful Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the church was destroyed. But when the Spanish returned in 1692, the residents of Awadavi did not put up much resistance, and the church was rebuilt over the main kiva in a demonstration of white Christian supremacy. As a result, 8 years later, by 1700, tensions between the converts at Awadavi and neighboring groups still engaged in resistance boiled over, and the community was destroyed by other Hopi, all the men killed, and the women and children scattered to other settlements. If you're interested in looking up some more information on that, I include a link there at the bottom. You can see in the bottom left some of the really remarkable archaeological finds from Awadavi include these gorgeous murals from the kiva at Awadavi. And you can see on the top right a recreation of what those murals would have looked like. And if you really find this particular thing fascinating, there's a very interesting book called Mesa of Sorrows, A History of the Awadavi Massacre by author James Brooks. I can recommend that as an additional source if this is something that you find compelling. So this is the incredibly short version, incredibly reduced down history of the ancestral Puebloan people of the Four Corners region. Today, contemporary populations in the area include descendants of those people as well as descendants of the Athapascan-speaking people that moved in during Pueblo IV times, as well as human-speaking populations from the Colorado River drainages, and Uto-Aztecan-speaking people in the area of Utah and southern Colorado. It's a diverse First Nations landscape. It's not homogeneous. There's not one Southwest tradition. And hopefully, just this little piece that we've selected to talk about gives you some idea of the complexity and richness of that tradition. And I hope it's something that you may find interesting enough to look into further. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.